Venezuela's collapse is really bad news for China. At 2 a.m. on January 3rd, American special forces entered the residence of Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro. Within just 2 hours, the longtime ruler of Venezuela and China's closest partner in the Caribbean was on a plane to New York to face charges in court. Trump says Maduro will be charged as a narco-terrorist for allegedly running a cartel that smuggled drugs into the US. A lot of people aren't convinced. They think that this was really about Venezuela's oil reserves, which are the largest in the world. And that may be true, but no matter what the actual reason was, one country clearly lost the most from Maduro's fall: China. For years, China has been deeply involved in Venezuela's economy. It has lent Venezuela over $100 billion since 2001. Meanwhile, Maduro's rule was disastrous. Under him, the economy completely collapsed, to the point where since taking power in 2013, nearly 8 million Venezuelans, about a quarter of the population, have fled the country, creating one of the largest refugee crises in the world. Needless to say, Venezuela couldn't pay back the Chinese loans, so it mostly paid in oil because that's like the only thing they had. That wasn't a problem for China though. In fact, this was exactly what they wanted and needed: a steady flow of cheap oil into their country. Over time, China became Venezuela's biggest oil customer, buying over 80% of its oil exports, which translates to roughly 4.5% of China's total crude oil imports. Now, losing that amount of oil isn't the end of the world. China can find oil elsewhere. The real issue is control. China had effective control over Venezuela's oil exports, right on America's doorstep, because Maduro's government was completely dependent on Chinese money. So when Maduro fell, China didn't just lose a political partner, it lost control over that oil. And who decides what happens to Venezuela's oil now? Well, the US, and that has huge consequences for China far beyond Venezuela. I'll talk about those later in the video. Trump made this very clear in his press conference after Maduro's capture.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Okay, so what is going to happen to those reserves?
We're going to run everything. We're going to run it.
He announced that the US would take control of Venezuela's oil industry and that it was willing to sell its oil at market price. This is huge because it means that America now controls whether China can access their oil and on what terms. That's a very different situation from having Maduro in power, who would have happily sold every barrel to China at a discount. Look, if a conflict really breaks out tomorrow between the US and China, let's say over an island near China, do you think the US will still sell China that Venezuelan oil? Probably not. China just lost a supply line it controlled for decades. And their response shows how seriously they see this situation. The Chinese government said Maduro's capture was a clear violation of international law and demanded the immediate release of Maduro and his wife. This event has sent shockwaves around the world. But oil was only part of the problem, because Venezuela wasn't just valuable to China for what it produced, it was also valuable for where it was. And once you look at Venezuela on the map, you start to see why China's loss matters so much. Venezuela doesn't just sit on oil, it sits in the Caribbean, close to two things that are absolutely critical to the US in any crisis. First, the US Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast, especially Texas, is the heart of America's energy system. This is where more than a third of US oil is refined. If oil is the blood of the global economy, Texas is one of its main pumping stations. Now imagine a real war with China. In that kind of conflict, the US needs to move enormous amounts of fuel, equipment, and supplies across the Pacific Ocean. That already stretches its logistics to the limit. Now what if we add a second problem? a China-aligned government sitting in the Caribbean, within reach of US energy infrastructure and shipping routes. Suddenly, the US can't just focus on Asia anymore. It has to defend its own backyard, not because Venezuela would definitely launch an attack, but because even the possibility of any attack near the Gulf Coast forces the US to have to tie down its limited military resources at home, fighting a war in Asia while also defending the energy hub that keeps your military and economy running. That's the nightmare scenario for Washington. And Venezuela creates a second risk at the same time. Just west of it sits one of the most important choke points in the global economy, the Panama Canal. Around 40% of US container traffic passes through it. In any conflict with China, most of the fuel, energy, and military logistics moving to Asia would have to pass through this canal. Any disruption here, especially from a hostile government nearby, would be a massive headache for the US. That's why America has shown zero tolerance for Chinese influence anywhere near the canal. In fact, in January 2025, shortly after taking office, Trump publicly threatened sanctions against a Hong Kong-based conglomerate called CK Hutchison. The Chinese-owned company operated the key ports at both ends of the Panama Canal, where ships enter and exit. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that control of the Chinese Communist Party over the Panama Canal was unacceptable, and the US would use any measures necessary to protect its rights. So under the intense US pressure in March 2025, CK Hutchison agreed to sell those ports in a $22.8 billion deal to a group of American companies. Trump celebrated the deal, saying the US had reclaimed the Panama Canal.
To further enhance our national security, my administration will be reclaiming the Panama Canal, and we've already started doing it.
China strongly criticized the sale, saying that the US forced it through despicable means. And the reaction tells you everything. Control over the Panama Canal is really important, and the US does not want even the possibility of Chinese influence near it in a crisis. And the China-aligned Venezuela was exactly that kind of risk. So when Maduro fell, in one move, the US eliminated two major pressure points China could have exploited in a future conflict. Now, whether that justifies an invasion and takeover of another country, I'm not so sure about that. But strategically, the logic is clear. And for all the global protests and condemnation of the US, no one could stop them or even try to. Not even China, because to the US, Venezuela sits in their backyard, and that matters more than anything else. China can project influence with money that it lends, build infrastructure, buy resources, but it cannot project military power in America's backyard. It has no military bases there and no realistic way to protect a partner so close to the US. And America has made the red line very clear. In December last year, the White House released its 2025 National Security Strategy. It states that securing the Western Hemisphere, which is North, Central, and South America, is the top priority for Trump's government. The goal is simple: remove vulnerabilities close to home and prevent rivals like China or Russia from gaining leverage there. From their point of view, taking down Maduro fits its strategy perfectly, but it's also a message to China to stay out of its backyard. The balance of power in this part of the world is clear for now, and this fact really shows China's lack of power in the region. Just hours before Maduro was captured, he met with China's Special Envoy for Latin American Affairs. The two sides reassured one another of deep strategic ties. But on the same night, Maduro was gone, and China clearly didn't see it coming. That's not just embarrassing, it seems to be a serious intelligence failure on China's part. China can protest all it wants, but it can't change what just happened. There's just no way it can do anything from so far away. The fallout doesn't stop with Venezuela, because Venezuela wasn't just one ally, it was one of China's most important footholds in Latin America. China's investment there was part of a broader strategy called the Belt and Road Initiative. The idea is simple. China lends money, it builds infrastructure, and in return, it secures long-term access to resources, trade routes, and influence. That model worked in Venezuela for years, and it's not just oil. China has been building similar ties across Latin America for other critical resources, like lithium in Argentina, Chile and Bolivia, copper from countries like Peru and Chile. These are the raw materials China needs for batteries, electric vehicles, and future supply chains. China has also invested in really important infrastructure. In Peru, it backed the construction of the Shanghai Megaport, a deep water port designed to link South America directly to Chinese trade routes across the Pacific Ocean. In Argentina, China operates the Espacio Lejano Station, a space facility run by China's military and used for satellite tracking. But now governments across the regions are watching what happened to Maduro, and they're asking a hard question. What will happen to us if we fall out of line with what America wants? These projects by China were meant to show that it could build lasting influence in the region. But the fact that Venezuela can just fall so easily shows that Chinese money doesn't come with Chinese protection. If the US decides to act, China can't really stop them. And that reality makes other governments more cautious about how much influence they allow China to build inside their countries. That's a serious problem for China if it wants to expand its influence to counter America and gear up for a future showdown between the two superpowers. Now, at this point, I know a lot of people online are saying that the US violating international law to kidnap Maduro gives China a justification to invade Taiwan. I just want to respond to this quickly and say that that's probably not going to happen. China doesn't really think that way. It plays the long game. It won't really lash out just because something happened overseas, especially if it doesn't directly affect China. If China reacted emotionally to every setback, sanctions would have destroyed its economy a long time ago. There's also a deeper difference here, because China does not view Taiwan as a foreign country. It sees it as an internal issue. So what the US did in Venezuela doesn't suddenly change China's calculations on Taiwan. China already believes it has the right to do what it wants to Taiwan. It hasn't done so because so far it feels that the risk and costs are too high and chances of success are too uncertain. That calculation hasn't changed overnight. But in the end, China will always adapt. It will study what went wrong in Venezuela and adjust its strategy. But Maduro's fall marked the end of uncontested Chinese expansion in America's backyard. From now on, China's supply chains for things like oil are more fragile and its partners are more exposed. And its influence, especially in America's backyard, comes with real political risk. Venezuela's collapse wasn't just bad news for China, it was a turning point and a glimpse of how the next phase of US-China competition will actually be fought. In the end, the most likely battlefield between US and China will be over Taiwan. And actually, we can predict how China intends to take Taiwan through looking at its aggressive actions around the island. If you want to learn more about that, check out this video right here.